today's World Insight with Tian Wei. Glitter, glamour, and global cinema at the 9th Beijing International Film Fest. The highlights and film entries in the spotlight. And as China and the US get down to serious trade talks, tensions rise between the EU and the US. The bottom line for European and American businessmen.
So I think that competition is very good, and I think the world's better off because we have the Europeans and the Americans competing with each other, and we'll
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show right here in the Chinese capital where the Beijing International Film Festival is taking place for the 9th year. Nearly 500 films from all over the world will be shown in selected theaters with tickets for festival favorites in high demand. Chinese audiences are expected to turn up in droves with a fierce passion for cinema. This is also a great time to take a look at the development of the Chinese movie industry and how China is opening up its market for cultural products from all over the world. Let's take a look.
This is not about football, Dad. He's a German. You can't just ignore that.
아기랑変な噂聞いたの。
なんか関係あんのあんた。
Пока ты жив, есть надежда.
The Composer, a co-production between China and Kazakhstan, based on the real story of a Chinese composer who was stranded in Kazakhstan in the 1940s, is one of the 15 films from 20 countries and regions that are competing for the top award at this year's Beijing International Film Festival. The film festival, on its 9th year, kicked off last Saturday in the Chinese capital. Gracing the red carpet were movie stars around the world who've had their eye on the size of the Chinese film industry. Since the founding of modern China 70 years ago, China's film industry has been part of the country's economic miracle. Last year, China's box office reached $9 billion, placing it as the world movie market. By 2020, there will be more than 80,000 big screens across the nation. The top 3 highest-grossing films of all time in China are produced by movie companies in Beijing, including the latest science fiction movie, The Wandering Earth. Foreign films also raked in audiences. This year, tickets for the 1968 Kubrick classic 2001: A Space Odyssey was sold out within 5 seconds, setting a new record in BJIFF's history.
The glamorous, of course, Beijing International Film Festival, but the issue is behind it. What's really the state of China's movie industry, and how is China working with the others around the world on this path of the very important development? Let's turn to our panelists with us in the Beijing studio. We have Chen Lei, the former CEO of Beijing Galloping Horse Film Company. Welcome, sir, to our program.
Thank you.
Also joining us
very much.
in Beijing, Professor Teng Jimeng, Associate Professor of American Studies Center from the Beijing Foreign Studies University, also a very well-known film critic from China. Joining us in Bangkok, we invited Andrei Volchek, who's an independent novelist and filmmaker. Andrei, welcome to the show as well. I want to start with the 2 Chinese panelists here in Beijing. You know better than I do, Mr. Cheng, about the latest development. 60 billion, as big as that, second largest in the world. That's the Chinese film market. So what does that mean for us?
That means a lot, especially for filmmakers. And this is, first of all, it's very exciting. That shows the industry is growing so fast. And also, of course, we're going to working harder because that's just the beginning, believe it or not.
Of course, Professor Tang, as far as I know, you never believed the market size is going to translate into the qualities of the film, if I remember right.
You are quite right. I think that there is great space
there we go.
great space for improvement in terms of Chinese films' quality, and especially in this very world of globalization, Chinese cinema needs to go abroad and go global. And so right now, if you talk about even The Wandering Earth, I mean, it is basically a Chinese diaspora event, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
you know, not that many Westerners would go see that film.
Well, probably it has a lot to do with whether the Chinese film products will have its outreach to the other markets around the world. Mr. Voltak, what do you say?
Well, I think that yes, China is filling the gap which is left by many film industries in the world, particularly in the West. Let's admit, Western cinema is in decline. There is nothing really anymore what you could, what you used to see in Italy, great Italian or French cinema in New Wave, in Neorealism in Italy. So China is actually creating both the very high quality entertainment films, but also it's filling the gap with the political films. So I think the diversity of Chinese cinema is tremendous. If you turn to Italian or French cinema now, it's either entertainment or it is basically me films. I got sick, I survived, I had a car accident, I survived. Chinese cinema is much deeper than that. It produces great historic films, critical films, films of basically that are along the spectrum from the left to the right. So I would say that Chinese cinema is much more interesting than what is being produced abroad.
You can tell Mr. Voltak really wants to jump into the big sea of the Chinese cinema and here in the Chinese market. But Mr. Cheng, I mean, you have to work on different projects over the years.
Yes.
When it comes to movie productions, and you know there are good stories, there are very bad stories. You know some really worked, some just didn't work at all. So if you talk about the qualities of the Chinese film industry now, generally speaking, how would you describe it to our viewers around the world?
Like I just mentioned, everything is just beginning. It's just great. Mentioned The Wandering Earth is a great project, big winning in the box office revenue. But as a filmmaker, we know that inside out, there's so many things we need to improve. There's so many challenges during the process.
Yeah.
However, I think the market, the size of the market, and the potential of the market, really exciting, and encourage filmmakers and people, you know, to make more and more good films, good stories.
It sounds abstract, what you just said. So let's just be specific. If you use the example of Wandering Earth earlier, we have some clips on our show already. So what do you think has led to its success, enormous box office success? It, of course, is a science fiction done by Liu Cixin, award-winning writer, but many say the story is not necessarily the key here, it's rather the special effect. Do you agree?
I can agree part of it, and also
you cannot always sitting on the fences and be so polite. Cheng,
I
that's
don't know,
not your
that's
style.
yes.
Have you changed your style because of the industry has changed it as well?
You want to know the inside story? I know what you want to know, but really, and there's lots of challenges. There's lots of, if you know the process, of course, it's not easy to make a good movie like that. However, I'm sure the director and the producer of the films, as you look back, as there's so many mistakes, if they can do it again, they want to do it better. And that's, however, we're going to thank our audience. Chinese audience is very, very appreciative whenever there's a film. Is, you know, film is basically reflect the local culture. So sometimes a good film not necessarily cross the culture, go all over the world. However, film successful is one thing. Box office winning, that's one thing. But good story and a decent film is another thing.
I see. You are trying to suggest, if I understand it diplomatically, that the audience is very tolerating in a way. Professor Tang, do you agree with that? Here in China, if you see some relatively good movies and it's making so-called a box office phenomenon, the Chinese audience is going to flock to the theaters and really buy their proportion to contribute to the success.
I think this is kind of an interesting phenomenon because sometimes I think it is the press that is making a hype. And that hype actually allure the audiences into the movie theater.
But you know, as long as the audience really like it, well, they can...
I mean, China actually was way, way ahead of Hollywood in terms of publicity, film publicity. This is also the message I took from this very morning's seminar workshop organized by MPA. I mean, this is also known throughout the world. We have so many streets. Writing these great messages for this film. But then once you enter into the movie theater, you are so disappointed, right?
Some of
but
them.
You're right.
But then,
You know,
in
generalize
the Wandering
like that.
Earth case, which may not be truth, right?
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
even Guo Fan this morning, he was talking about
director of the movie, of
the
course,
director of the
you're talking
movie,
about.
and he was said, "Oh, I need to sit down and criticize myself and continue to improve through trial screenings, even impose the successes of the Wandering Earth."
But you know, Mr. Volchak, I want to come to you. You are observing China from a different angle rather than these two insiders here in China. You see, it seems that the Chinese audience is very appreciative as long as there are certain elements in the Chinese-made movies that they think are up to the international standards or close to the international standards. They're going to show their support. Is that phenomenon rare in terms of development stages of the movie markets that you have seen, not only here in China, but also in the other markets as well in history? Mr. Volchak.
Well, I think actually that Chinese audience is very diverse. Let me just, from top of my head, let me just think about 3 Chinese films, 3 blockbuster films in totally different genres that were produced in the last 10 years. One is Let the Bullets Fly, of course. One is I Am Not Madame Bovary, and one is The Beast. 3 totally different films, and 3 films that were extremely successful with Chinese audience. Now, so we cannot, I don't think we can talk about Chinese audience as something homogeneous. There are people who are longing for very high quality art films. There are people who are looking for satire, political satire, and there are people who just want to be entertained. And all these 3 films are actually masterpieces in their own way. So even me being an independent filmmaker, I'm much more interested in art, cinema, in documentary films that I make. Of course, I would be Let the Bullets Fly. It would not be a film that I would choose to watch, but it's a great film. So all 3 films are of extremely high quality, and I think this is symbolic to what is happening now with Chinese audience in relation to the Chinese films.
So there's so many diversities, it seems, that you're suggesting about the Chinese market. Professor Teng, you agree with that? And what do you think about that diversity in terms of pushing the filmmakers to do the best story, the best production, and probably making Chinese movies even more global in a way?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think that the Chinese cinema is doing well, because of this very diversity of the audiences. People go to see Let the Bullet Fly, people go to see I'm Not Madame Bovary, and people also go to see...
Those are only 3 movies that you see among the many that these days are popped out.
Right, and so innovation, I mean, to me, innovation is key for China to go global. And so
what is the innovation you're talking about here, sir?
I mean, story-wise, for example, this time around in The Wandering Earth, I mean, it's not just about this great kind of a fancy stunt and also special visual effect. It's also about this father and son relationship. That very interesting kind of a dynamics, the kind of an interesting dichotomy in between these 2 characters are also very appealing to the audiences worldwide, and also particularly in China. And if you see The Meg also features this very father and daughter relationship. I mean, Li Bingbing featuring this very independent daughter, the kind of, even though it's kind of a mother with a child, but then still very, very self-reliant, very, in a sense, progressive, very headstrong in terms of pursuing her career. And so I see a diversity, but then interestingly, this very diversity is built upon this very diverse market.
Are we graduating from the very early stage of the market? Are we going to the next stage in which there is like a warring states period of time? You have all kinds of genres that's available for the audience, which is wonderful. And you also have so many different layers of products when it comes to quality, which is also natural. But at the end of the day, where are we going from here? Are we following Hollywood, or are we likely more to have a favor into the European movie making process? What is it, Chen Lei?
Well, I think either way, I think we should towards to the same target, either Hollywood or European market or Chinese market. We all want to make a good story, good films. So you see the films in general. There's commercial films, there's art house films. This doesn't matter how you're gonna make a good film. Good film means you have a good story to tell. So that's. And also, of course, entertain audience. So China right now is just the beginning, even though there's big numbers in the box office revenue, even though the single films can make very successful, but that doesn't reflect the whole industry.
What is the whole industry to you?
The whole industry to me in China right now, we need to improve ourselves. We need to learn from the better market, for example, Hollywood, European art house films.
What you are learning about?
You learn from all different aspects. First of all, how to tell a story, how to write a good story, professionally good writer, how to write a good script, and then how to process from a word, good script, to a film, pictures. So there's involve lots of technical things. So there's visual effects, post-production, there's...
So you think every area, there needs to be a lot of study. China should be on the learning curve.
Yes, that's my personal opinion. I think we need to learn a lot. Of course, every market is different. We have our culture, deeply our culture. We are the only one to know how to present our culture, to tell Chinese story. That's our benefit. And also another benefit is we get the audience. We get so big market. However, the technical part, the visual effects, post-production, the other things we can learn.
Professor Tang, go ahead.
I may not agree with you, if I may. Sorry.
Totally.
I think that we are basically graduating. We are graduating from this very kind of a baby walking or kind of a huddling. I mean, this sort of thing.
Okay.
I think China is like India. I mean, India actually was very much graduating by inventing a new genre movie. For example, Indian musical. I mean, India walked out of that very kind of initial preliminary stage, being this baby walking, and now emerged as one of the most powerhouse in terms of cinema and filmmaking in the world. Their musicals is so very good, and even their feature film is also very good.
Why are you saying China is very much like India?
Because we are all developing countries.
Was that necessarily?
We have the largest audience with the largest population.
But the background is totally different. The Indian market, the China market is quite different. And if you look at the history of Chinese film developing, we start from the big studios. I forgot 8 big studios from the state-owned.
I mean, state-owned,
State-owned, former Soviet Union style kind of studio, and now you have much more private ones, but smaller ones too, right?
Yes.
And you also have joint production as well.
Yes.
So it's very different.
Yes. Right. And on the other side, the Indian doesn't have that kind of process.
No, I mean, India is so very innovative in telling their own stories. I mean, to come back to your storytelling technique, right? And the content, I mean, which is supposed to be the king. I mean, India actually tells the greatest story about a nation emerging from a colonial country.
But the question really is, we are talking about the Chinese film market.
And so we are also emerging. For example, we are emerging, and 2 films that actually stands out quite a bit. I think one is Wolf Warrior series. The Wolf Warrior as a new genre, military war thriller. I mean, and also Operation Red Sea. I mean, these great blockbusters. I mean, Operation Red Sea stands out as the biggest one. I mean,
so right here, so Mr. Volchek, have you heard from these 2 gentlemen? It seems that it is only the blockbuster, at least according to Professor Tang here, that has really made its mark over the past few years. Do you agree with that?
Well, what I really think, I would like to also come back to the previous discussion. I really don't think that Chinese cinema should learn much from modern-day Hollywood. I mean, there is no storytelling anymore. It disappeared. I mean, I hope we are talking about Hollywood from 1960s and 1970s.
Yeah, it's mainly blockbusters,
and
right?
Earlier.
It's about special effects.
Yeah,
big
it's all blockbusters and
series of
and
movies.
if you study, if you study film in the United States, you know that it's not even written by writers most of the time.
But you know, Mr. Volchek, as sophisticated as you are only hoping the Chinese market is going one way or the other. But we are trying to say what exactly the reality of the market. I think that is probably even more important than our hope. And only by studying the reality do we know where to go from here.
I mean, yeah, I mean, so that's why I think that we need to look to India. I mean, India actually emerged as a powerhouse, not just telling, oh, we are a big country, big population, but India tells its nationalism. It's a film featuring its Indian nationalism. It's the major
Nationalism
vocal
is a
feature.
big word
It's a
that
big,
you use over there. It's a very political word.
it's
I
a
have
very
to
positive
say.
word. It's
But
a very positive word.
everybody has their own problem.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
a different
right.
market have a different problem.
Right.
I agree
Why don't
that
you see
Hollywood have the
challenges?
Hollywood problem. China has its own. You know, we're beginning. The good news is this market is big. India somehow they have their own problem. They have their own issues they're going to deal with. I think. The very exciting news is the China market. We're sitting in the China market.
Yeah.
China market is really, really growing.
Yeah,
growing
but
you know,
fast.
but
one
the
trend we need to
issue-
guard against is that we should not close up, right? India
you can-
just
you can
goes
also
abroad.
learn a
Look
lot
at all
from
these Indian
Iran,
diasporas in the Middle
from
East,
Iranian
in Southeast
cinema.
Asia.
Yeah,
And
Mr.
even-
Volchak, you want to say something briefly?
Yes, I'm sorry because I cannot see you, so I only hear, I'm in a studio, so I cannot, I'm sorry. Basically, I want to say that China can learn also from Iran. Iranian cinema is now, you know, producing one masterpiece after another already for 2 decades with very small production costs. And it is really underappreciated in the West, but it is telling the story of Iran in the most incredible way. It reinvented basically neorealism that we knew in Italy. It's very popular among the critics. Of course, but there are many other things. I think China is doing very correct thing that it's cooperating with Russia, with this, with the Middle East now, with Kazakhstan, with Central Asia. I mean, and making films with the neighboring countries, with the countries that are not
Diversity
necessarily
that you're talking
Western,
about, and also opening.
It's
And
diversity, definitely.
Yes, as we see, Mr. Chen, for example, with the trade negotiations going on between China and the United States, many are talking about potential of further opening up of the Chinese market, cultural products included. So what are we talking about here right now? What kind of challenges does it mean for Chinese filmmakers? Because you have better products coming in, or more powerful products at least coming in, with a very big professionalism behind it. Whether those are the so-called best quality films is another question. But so how much challenge do you think the Chinese filmmaking industry will be able to face up to at this point?
Many, many challenges. For example, you know, I talk about the technical things, also how to make a good story. Start from beginning, the basic, how to write a good script.
You earlier mentioned about that. The question is, the market is going to further open up.
Sure.
So how much will the industry be able to endure and thrive? You got only 40 seconds to say something about that.
All right, I'm happy about the future. There's so much things we can do.
But excuse me, I don't think that China should open
Okay, 20
more.
seconds, sir.
I don't think that China should open more to the United States government, considering the current fatigue. Think about the current blockbuster in China right now, and from Hollywood, Shazam actually is
It's
doing
not just
so
the American
bad.
films, but also films
it's-
from the other countries too.
It's the fatigue. But then look at the film from India. Currently, there is an Indian week. I mean, it's going on in this festival.
I think everybody should open
All right,
up.
we
learn
have
from
10
each
seconds.
other.
We have 10 seconds. Let Mr. Volchak just to say something. Final words, sir.
Yes, I wanted to say that China should definitely not only learn from the West. I mean, look at these wonderful films now coming from Japan, for example, The Shoplifters, a great cinema from Iran. There is so much to learn. It doesn't have to be the West all the time. And I think China has its own voice. It has Shanghai School of Cinema already from 1930s. It's one of the most brilliant cinema schools in the world. So
okay, we're running out of time. Andrea Volchak, Chen Lei, and Teng Jimeng, I want to express my appreciation to the three of you for being here and also discuss the future of Chinese movies. Of course, a lot to expect. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And you are watching World Inside with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. China and the U.S. get down to serious trade talks. Tensions rise between the EU and the U.S. The bottom line, we're going to find out after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Trade negotiations between China and the U.S. are progressing smoothly, according to the latest media reports, and both sides are expected to reach an agreement. But it's a different story for trade dispute between the U.S. and Europe, some say. In a tweet, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose tariffs of $11 billion worth of EU products. The U.S. and Europe have accused each other of illegal subsidies to aircraft giants, Europe-based Airbus and U.S.-based Boeing, to give them an edge in the passenger jet business. Amid the worsening feud, what are the implications of China-U.S. relations on the world's other trading nations? I asked that questions and many more to the heads of the Chamber of the European Union and the Chamber of American Business here in China. Let's listen in our conversation. Tim, Adam, what a pleasure to have both of you on CGTN. I want to start from the trade negotiations. Everybody is following what's going on between China and the United States. Tim, as chairman of AmCham in China, your assessment of what exactly is the nature of these negotiations now?
Well, I think we're getting near to the end game, and by that I mean I think now each side has a pretty clear understanding of the hopes and the expectations of the other side, and so it's a matter of trying to close the remaining gaps. I think it took a while for the Chinese side to understand what the U.S. side was really seeking, and maybe it took a while for the U.S. side to articulate that. But now I think the two sides have real traction in the negotiations, and I think both sides are working very, very hard to try to reach an agreement.
Reach an agreement. What kind of nature is that agreement, according to you, given the knowledge that you have so far?
Part of the agreement will talk about trade and perhaps purchases of American products from China. That's really not the core of the agreement from the point of view of the American business community in China. We're more interested in some of the deeper structural issues, ways in which our two economic systems are different and in some ways incompatible, and that's created some difficult competitive situations, and I think the U.S. business community is interested in addressing those differences.
Adam, well, as the one representing the EU chamber here in China, of course you are watching this very closely, what's going on between China and the United States. Many wonder what's going to be its implications of this trade agreement, if there is any, for the other economies.
It's a good question. Obviously, we are watching it and very interested to see what happens. Obviously, if it results in economic changes, structural changes that are beneficial for all companies, that's something that we would welcome very much. The EU has its concerns in China as well, and so we also are working with the Chinese on what's called a comprehensive agreement on investment. And most recently, it's been announced that EU and China look to complete that by 2020. So I think having the US work on one side and EU working on the other side, hopefully this can be a win-win-win situation.
How much contribution the EU as a whole and the individual European capitals could be, given what is going on between China and the United States? Apparently there are some tensions.
Well, in terms of contribution, I mean, let's not forget that approximately 1/2 of China's exports to the world come from foreign companies that are invested here. And from a very broad perspective, EU-China relations are very strong in terms of the trade relationship. We're China's biggest trading partner and number 2 from the European perspective. But very important for us is to build on that. So in terms of investment, I mean, last year European companies invested 10 times as much more in the US than we did in China. Right. So representing European interests here in China, my goal is to bring more investment here, and we can do that if China continues to move a little bit more quickly in terms of its opening.
And how do you see the cooperation and competition with your American counterparts?
I think what we're talking about here are the rules in which we all abide by, and that economic model that we've been talking about as well, making sure that we all have a clear understanding of what those rules are and that we enforce them accordingly.
We do see, for example, recently what's going on in Boeing with the recent accidents. There seem to be much more opportunities provided for the European counterpart, such as Airbus. So how do you see that kind of a competition for a huge potential market like China, which is already your biggest market anyway, Tim?
Well, I think Boeing and Airbus have had very strong competition for many years, and I think everybody benefits from that competition. Sometimes Boeing pushes ahead, sometimes Airbus comes out with a new product or development. And so I think that competition is very good, and I think the world's better off because we have the Europeans and the Americans competing with each other, and we'll be better off to have China also in the competitive mix.
And
yeah, I was just going to add, but what's also very important in all this is what we've been talking about too, is having a clear understanding of the rules and the policies and creating a safe environment as well. So very important for us in terms of cooperating with China is coming to an agreement on a bilateral aviation safety agreement. This was something that's been brought up in the last month with the high-level summit that took place, and that's something that I think would be good for EU and China as well, and for the world.
when we are talking about the relationship of businesses, for example, and trade between China and the United States and China and the EU, there seems to be very different political environment at the back of it. Now, Tim, I have to go to you about the US side, what's going on, because many believe there is a potential, at least a Cold War, building up between these two economies. Now, we know for businesses, it's not prospering in the Cold War situation. What does that mean, the so-called political correctness in the United States for American businesses these days around the world?
In AmCham, what we're trying to do is help our governments understand the legitimate concerns of each other and come up with a new set of guidelines that will be predictable and that will maximize as much as possible the areas for us to continue to do business with one another.
Having said that, though, and also the great work AmCham has been doing as a communicator and a bridge builder, some have been suspecting whether the business communities, particularly the United States ones, are as daring as it used to be to speak out to both governments, particularly the American government, given your political environment right now.
I don't think it's a matter of daring, to be honest.
Is that because you're the chairman of AmCham in China right now? Is that a politically correct statement to make?
I feel free to make whatever statement I'd like to make. And the statement I'd like to make here is that the American business community and also I think the business community from other countries, you can speak about Europe, but I think people have felt that the business environment in China has not been as welcoming for their business in the past. And now we certainly see that the Chinese government is taking steps to address our concerns.
We see a lot of bilateral promising deals being done right now, but when it comes to a platform like the EU, which is taking the pride of being a platform, incorporating and bringing consensus to the EU economies, it's not necessarily as promising as bilateral right now. Is the EU now giving up its strength of bringing the economies together regarding China, particularly regarding cooperating with China?
I don't think so. I mean, the EU last year, or 2 years ago, released its connectivity policy, and this is something that I think works very well with the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is something that's being done on a pan-European level, and it's got the involvement of the member states involved in that as well. So the unity of the European Union, if you look at recent surveys and polls, has never been stronger than it has in the last 10 years. And the recent agreements that we've seen coming out of Brussels, I think, are a strong indicator of that.
The business community has been calling for more opening up and reform, as both of you beautifully illustrated. Now, we had earlier at the two sessions, which I was covering in extensive way, the foreign investment law. Now, many say it is a very structural law with which there are a lot of details that needs to be worked out and also outlined. Now, Tim, to you, what do you think are some of the most important things, with them in mind that you know pragmatism would drive us long, not necessarily just idealism? Tim.
Well, I think the foreign investment law has a lot of very good principles that are enunciated. And I think what the business community is looking to is to see how this will be implemented in practice. I mean, both as a practicing lawyer here and also an AmCham chair, I still have companies calling me and complaining about experiences they're having that violate some of these commitments. But of course, this law doesn't take effect until January 1. So what we're hoping is that there will be implementing regulations and then a kind of a new a spirit and a new discipline within the Chinese bureaucracy that will really implement those principles, because the principles themselves are quite encouraging.
To you, Adam, what does that say? What are some of specific areas you are looking at from the EU perspective?
I think the commitment not to use administrative measures to force technology transfer is something we're very interested in. How they're actually going to do that in practice is going to be interesting to see. We had some concern about the word administrative. From our point of view, it should be any measure shouldn't be used to force technology transfer, not simply administrative. I've discussed this issue many times with my Chinese counterparts, and it's an interesting one because sometimes they say, well, where's the legislation that says it's a forced technology transfer? Sometimes the understanding of what forced technology transfer varies from simply a local official saying, hey, if you want to get your permit or your license, you need to transfer the technology, which is very direct and very clear, and I think a simple way of looking at it. Other ways of looking at it is a lot of companies, China's done a good job at reducing joint venture requirements in financial sector, in the auto sector, but they still exist in a lot of the service industry and agriculture. And for a lot of companies that want to invest here, for them to do that joint venture, they have to offer something, and it's their technology.
We are in an uncharted water. So a lot of things are all on the learning curve for every one of us. We have never done this before, but there's something that we need to do. So how can we work together to figure out what are the bottom lines of every party involved and be able to take care of it as much as possible? But at the end of the day, you still need to get one thing done. So that is the thing we're discussing here as well. It's not only what's in the law, but also how different parties, listening to your voices coming from different players, the Chinese would work with you eventually for the final products when it comes to details. To your knowledge, what exactly will be likely this process, and how are you going to contribute not just to the Chinese side but also be able to talk to one another about that? Tim.
I think the most challenging part of the trade negotiations right now between the US and China is what they're referring to as an enforcement mechanism. Right now, the two countries were trying to solve problems through negotiations and dialogues. That didn't work from the US perspective, so they imposed tariffs. And so China didn't like that, so they imposed tariffs. The question is, in the future, when we have significant disputes, can we resolve it without, again, imposing tariffs or taking other measures like that? Or will we be able to sit down and talk the issues through and resolve them without having to resort to that? To me, that's the most important question.
And is there any solution to that, sir?
Well, I think both countries have to recognize that that they both better listen to the other side, and they ought to take the concerns of the other side seriously. I think both sides recognize that if that doesn't happen, then we'll be back in the near future to where we are today.
To you, Adam, what exactly is it?
We were talking about earlier globalization, making sure that the benefits don't leave people behind. And I think one thing that needs to be discussed as well is making use of global institutions and multilateral systems. So WTO reform, everybody agrees, WTO needs to be reformed. People have different priorities on what aspects of that need to happen, but that certainly needs to happen, and it needs to happen for not simply for the issues that we're all aware of, but I would also say countries are competing against each other, and many of them will then have policies that quite frankly leave themselves in a less opportune situation to ensure that that those that are being left behind are better taken care of.
What do you think is the key here when we talk about whether the business community will still be the very important component for a future discussion of both the stability, peace, and hopefully a better economies on different sides? Adam.
I think it's what actually happens. There's a lot of things being said in the media and by senior leadership, and many people say we welcome statements on this and that, but ultimately what's most important is actual action that is taken. So as I've said, we've seen that in a couple of areas where China has made those reforms in the last year or two, but we're looking to see more. And business, as I said earlier, they respond to that. They see market opening and they feel more welcome. They see market opening and they invest more. We've had, I'd say, half a dozen European companies that have made multi-billion-dollar investments because of the most recent openings. So when that happens, the investment will come, the confidence will come with it as well.
And Tim, to you, what role can the business community eventually play? What are going to make the business communities in different parts of the world still relevant today?
Well, I think the benefits from our business activities to all the countries concerned make us very relevant. I think that because we're here on the ground, we live and breathe business in China. And so I think we have a very realistic and concrete sense of how things are working. Right. And I think we're in a very good position to help the government of China and our own home countries understand what the issues are so that we can focus on the real problems and find solutions.
Tim, Adam, what a pleasure to have both of you gentlemen for being with us, helping us from your perspective what exactly is going on. It's very important understanding. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From Mi Tianwei and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.